At 8:47 a.m., under a humid gray sky at Halvin International Airport, a matte black Range Rover rolled silently into the luxury terminal's private entrance. From the back seat stepped a man in a plain black hoodie, gray joggers, and spotless white sneakers. No entourage, no flashy briefcase, just a slim leather backpack over one shoulder and a calm, unhurried walk. He didn't shout for attention. He didn't wear a name badge or display wealth. He simply approached the private Sky Suite entrance where only platinum-tier clients were granted access. That's when the mistake was made. The security agent took one look at the hoodie and dismissed him without scanning credentials. "This lane's for VIPs," he said flatly. He didn't realize he was speaking to Jordan R. King, founder of Onyx Airlines, majority stakeholder in their parent company, and the man set to finalize a multi-billion-dollar acquisition of Luxport Aviation that very morning. Within 10 minutes, a ripple of firings would begin, triggered not by volume, but by silence, by the kind of man who doesn't need to shout to shatter the ground beneath your feet. Before we dive into the full story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. The sun struggled to pierce through the thick layer of morning haze that blanketed Halvin International, casting the airport in a diffused silver light. Everything looked serene on the surface, shiny marble floors glistening under polished ceilings, crisp announcements echoing from above, travelers sipping overpriced espresso. But just outside the private Sky Suite entrance, something quietly monumental was unfolding. Jordan R. King stood at the edge of the roped-off VIP lane, posture, calm expression, unreadable. He wasn't irritated, offended, or indignant. He was observing. He had been here before, not at this exact airport, but in this exact moment. Dismissed because he didn't fit the image people had constructed around power. Dismissed because quiet authority in a hoodie doesn't match the caricature of success they'd been taught to expect. The security agent, Mason Creed, didn't know his name. He didn't check the list. He didn't scan the black metal access card Jordan offered. He simply saw clothing and color, and in a split second decided, not a VIP. Jordan didn't argue. He simply nodded. One stepped back and sat down on a nearby metal bench just outside the automatic doors. Legs crossed, hands relaxed, leather backpack beside him. The world buzzed around him. Passengers wheeled bags. Employees rushed past. A few cast curious glances at him, wondering if he was lost. He wasn't. He pulled out his phone. A fingerprint scan opened a secure folder labeled Luxport Acquisition. Inside it, digital contracts, wire instructions, executive dossiers. The transfer of power for one of the most prestigious aviation concierge services in the world sat right there, neatly packaged in a handful of encrypted documents. The man they had just refused entry was moments away from owning the very company that employed them. Back inside the suite in the gleaming lounge designed for celebrities, billionaires, and dignitaries, the head of private client services, Kevin Slate, leaned comfortably in a designer chair, tapping lazily through a tablet that listed high-priority guest arrivals. Jordan R. King was right there, top of the list, flagged as platinum priority. Kevin didn't blink. His assistant Connor had mentioned that someone outside claimed to be on the list. Jordan King, Kevin muttered, scrolling through the list. "Yes, sir," said he was on the manifest. He was dressed a little casually. Kevin barely looked up. "If he doesn't look the part, he's not the part. We don't escort every guy in a hoodie just because he says he's important." Connor hesitated. "But he's marked as we curate image, Connor," Kevin cut in. "Not just access. If you belong here, you should look like you belong here. That's the standard." Back on the bench, Jordan's phone buzzed. A notification from his acquisition attorney, Matthew Rhee. "Final acquisition package ready. Awaiting your trigger." Jordan typed back just 2 words. "Hold 10. Then he slid the phone into his pocket and resumed watching. A few yards away, Mason leaned against the podium, sipping from a paper cup, chatting with a fellow security agent. "Guy in a hoodie tried to stroll in here like he was Jeff Bezos," he laughed. "Said he was on some list. Didn't even scan his pass." Travis, the other guard, smirked. "Let me guess. Backpack, sneakers, confident walk." "Exactly." Mason grinned. "Told him to use the regular terminal like everyone else." Jordan heard every word. He didn't need microphones. Body language and tone told him more than enough. This wasn't an isolated act of oversight. It was systemic performance arrogance, rehearsed and refined until it passed for professionalism. This wasn't just about Mason. It was about an entire structure that let men like Mason feel safe in their bias. 10 minutes passed. Jordan stood slowly, stretched slightly, and turned toward the parking lane where his car had dropped him off. Another black vehicle glided into position, but this one didn't open its doors. Inside, sitting with a clipboard and an encrypted tablet, was an acquisitions compliance officer named Naomi Ross. She had flown in overnight on Jordan's instruction, ready for one job implement, a surprise audit if Luxport's leadership failed a visual inclusion threshold. Jordan met her eyes through the tinted window and gave the faintest nod. Her fingers tapped a message into a secure app, Phase 1 Initiate Internal Review. At that exact moment inside the private Sky Suite, Barry, the concierge assistant working behind the main counter, noticed something. The name Jordan R. King still sat at the top of the manifest. Unchecked. Not cleared. No escort issued. He looked up nervously. Something didn't feel right. He turned to Kevin, still browsing presentations for an upcoming leadership award speech. Sir, Barry said, Jordan R. King hasn't been processed. He's marked as top-tier platinum clearance. Kevin shrugged. Then he missed his slot. We don't wait for people who don't show up properly. But, Barry hesitated. I think he did show up. Kevin didn't even look up. Barry trusts the system. If he was important, we'd have known it. 10 minutes later, they'd all know it. Barry had never been one to question authority, not directly. For the better part of his 8-year tenure at Halvin International's private Sky Suite, he'd stuck to protocol, nodded politely, followed the chain of command. But today, something about the unchecked name at the top of the manifest gnawed at his conscience like a splinter beneath the skin. He double-checked the screen. Jordan R. King. Arrival Jordan 9:00 a.m. Status platinum priority. Escort required. The clock on his screen read 9:22. He glanced toward the entrance, then toward Kevin Slate, who was now reviewing his client experience excellence speech for the third time, searching for the perfect phrase to describe his leadership style. Barry took a shallow breath, printed the manifest page with Jordan's name highlighted in bold, and quietly slid it into a folder beneath his desk. Out in the general terminal, Jordan still sat on the bench. He hadn't moved. His black hoodie blended with the dark backdrop of the tinted glass exterior, and if anyone had looked at him now, they might have thought he was waiting for a delayed flight. But Jordan was waiting for something very different. Inside his jacket pocket, his phone buzzed once, then again. Naomi Ross, internal trigger confirmed. Corporate acknowledgement received. We're live. Matthew Reed Luxport board notified. Control in motion. Full compliance review pending. The wheels were turning, and not just metaphorically. In the secure corporate server rooms of Onyx Aeroch's operations division, a cascade of digital notices was rolling out across the Luxport internal hierarchy. It had taken less than 10 minutes to draft the cultural compliance memorandum, the equity evaluation trigger, and a provisional list of personnel flagged for review under previously unreported bias incidents. Back inside the suite, Kevin Slate finally took notice of the subdued tension in the room. Barry wasn't making eye contact. The phone lines had gone silent. Even Connor, his normally chatty assistant, had gone quiet and pale. What's going on? Kevin asked, eyes flicking around. Connor cleared his throat, stepping forward, holding out a printed memo that had just arrived from the operations channel. Sir, you need to read this. Kevin raised an eyebrow. He snatched the paper, eyes scanning the top line. Then the next, then the header at the bottom. Immediate corporate transition of Luxport Private Client Services. New controlling entity, Blackstone Dominion. Holdings acting chairman, Jordan R. King. His heart skipped a beat. For a split second, the elegant world he had curated, the suites, the silent smiles, the scented towels crumbled like glass under pressure. No, he whispered, gripping the page tighter. It's not possible. Across the hall, Mason Creed was still stationed near the VIP podium, arms crossed, smirking as he whispered something to Travis, the second guard. You know how many fake VIPs show up in track pants thinking they're important, he muttered. Travis chuckled. Yeah, let the shoes do the talking. That's what I always say. But they both went quiet when the elevator to the east wing dinged softly and a team of 3 men stepped out. Their suits were sharp, dark, and without logos, but every movement they made screamed executive authority. One of them carried a leather briefcase. Another held a folded folder marked Confidential Immediate Action. The lead man, an older gentleman with salt and pepper hair and a demeanor honed by boardroom wars, headed straight toward Kevin's office. His name was Ezra Langford, Onyx Arach's Internal Affairs Director, and he was not here for pleasantries. By the time Kevin looked up from the memo and caught sight of Ezra, his throat had gone dry. "Mr. Slate," Ezra said calmly, "your presence is required in conference room C." Now, Kevin stood slowly blinking as if emerging from a fog. Of course. But this is a mistake, I think." Ezra didn't answer. He simply turned and began walking. At the same time, back near the entrance, Jordan R. King stood from the bench. He dusted off his hoodie sleeves, adjusted the strap of his backpack, and began walking toward the main terminal. Each step was measured deliberate, as he passed a digital sign showing Private Sky Suite, VIP check-in. He paused briefly and turned to look at his reflection in the glass. Same hoodie, same sneakers, same composure. But now the reflection belonged to the owner of everything behind that door. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. Inside the suite, Barry watched from behind the counter as the glass doors opened and Jordan entered. Their eyes met for a moment. Barry, unsure what to do, gave a small nod, half greeting, half apology. Jordan returned the nod without a word and kept walking. Past the reception desk, past the security checkpoint, past the gold-trimmed door that once blocked his entry. A woman with a headset tried to stop him. "Sir, I'm sorry, but this area is restricted to—" "I know," Jordan said, holding up his ID card with the Onyx Arach seal. "I'm the reason it is." She blinked stunned, then stepped aside. Jordan moved through the lounge with silent precision. Employees noticed, heads turned, conversations halted mid-sentence. It was like watching gravity shift in real time, every social instinct reorienting around a new center of mass. At that same moment, Ezra entered conference room C and placed the confidential folder on the obsidian black table. Kevin Slate stood at the threshold, frozen. Then Jordan walked in behind him. He didn't sit. He didn't announce himself. He simply said, "Let's begin." The conference room's silence was punctuated only by the faint mechanical hum of the air conditioning vent and the soft scrape of Jordan R. King's chair as he slowly took a seat at the head of the obsidian glass table. Kevin Slate remained standing, his hand still gripping the edge of the chair closest to him, knuckles pale. On the table before him lay the confidential folder, still unopened, still humming with threat. Ezra Langford, calm as a scalpel, took a seat to Jordan's right and tapped twice on the tablet in front of him. A wireless projector quietly flickered to life, its beam, throwing a display against the wall behind Jordan. A single line of white text on a black background appeared: Luxport Compliance Records. Subject: Kevin Slate. Kevin's eyes widened. Wait. This isn't—" He stumbled over his own breath. "I haven't been accused of anything. I've followed every protocol." Ezra raised a hand. "We're not here for accusations. We're here for patterns." With another tap of his stylus, the display changed. A timeline appeared: 9 months' worth of internal logs, complaint records, and video captures. Each entry had a date, time, and incident descriptor. The room was cast in the glow of illumination, but for Kevin it felt like exposure. The first incident, February 9th, 17 a.m., guest denied lounge access despite valid platinum ID. Then another, March 3rd, 11:22 a.m. Discrepancy between treatment of guest with ethnic surname versus white counterpart during check-in. And another, April 19th, 8:35 a.m. Doesn't look the part, comment recorded on internal comms. Kevin's voice cracked. These were isolated. None of them were formal complaints. "Because you ensured they never reached formal status," Ezra said flatly. 2 were redirected to Connor before they could be logged. 1 was settled with a complimentary upgrade and verbal apology without documentation. But our compliance AI picked up anomalies in the conversation logs and behavior patterns over time. Ezra tapped once more. The next screen showed internal chat logs transcribed with AI-enhanced accuracy. Several lines bore Kevin's name. "Can we reassign check-in for that kind of guest? Image matters. No hoodies at VIP, even if they're listed. Let's not dilute the experience with ambiguity." Kevin felt the blood drain from his face. His own words stared back at him, unmistakable, irrefutable. Jordan didn't move. He didn't speak. His silence pressed heavier than any outburst could have. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here to dissect. Ezra continued, voice steady. "This isn't about one morning, Mr. Slate. This is about 9 months of pattern matching. A culture of gatekeeping that you curated, normalized, and enforced. Kevin tried to interject. I was trying to maintain standards. Standards that reject professionalism when it comes in unfamiliar packaging. Ezra interrupted, raising an eyebrow. Or ones that define professionalism by pedigree and fabric, not by performance. Jordan finally spoke. His voice was low-measured but sharp. You built a velvet rope culture in a building meant to represent hospitality. That's not excellence. That's elitism. Kevin swallowed hard. So what happens now? Jordan tilted his head slightly. What always happens when a system refuses to reform, it gets replaced. A pause. Then Ezra turned to the remaining 2 men at the table, representatives from Onyx Iracha's Ethics Oversight Board. Are we in agreement? Ezra asked. Both nodded without hesitation. Ezra faced Kevin. Effective immediately, your role as Director of Client Experience is terminated. Your security clearance is revoked. You'll be escorted from the property after this meeting. Kevin stared down at his hands, which now trembled visibly. But my name's on the industry awards shortlist. I was set to present at that award is being rescinded, Ezra said, already tapping out a message on his tablet. We've sent a letter to the committee with full context. They were quite understanding. Kevin looked up at Jordan, something bitter and resentful curling in his expression. This is personal. No, Jordan replied calmly. That would have happened the moment I walked away. This is systemic. The door behind Kevin opened with a soft hydraulic hiss. 2 uniformed personnel from airport corporate security waited quietly at the threshold. Not aggressive, not threatening, just present. Jordan stood. This isn't the end of your life, Mr. Slate, but it is the end of your unchecked power. Kevin didn't reply. He turned jaw tight and walked out without another word. The door whispered shut behind him. In the silence that followed, Ezra tapped once more on his tablet and brought up a new file, Equity Integration Initiative. Phase 2. Jordan had glanced at it, then at the remaining team. Begin orientation, he said. Outside, beyond the frosted glass windows of the conference room, the hallway was alive with whispers. But inside, change had already taken root. The removal of Kevin Slate rippled through Luxport like a shockwave. Not explosive, but subterranean, an undercurrent that quietly shifted the foundation beneath every department, every corridor, every policy manual. His office, once the nerve center of curated gatekeeping, now sat empty, its glass walls reflecting nothing but silence and anticipation. By noon, Jordan R. King had summoned the senior leadership team into the Central Operations Boardroom, a space rarely used except for year-end reviews or when the CEO of Luxport himself made an appearance. Now the CEO was gone. Terminated quietly the night before in a separate meeting Jordan conducted without a word of press. The remaining department heads filed in cautiously, each trying to read the tone of the room. There were no nameplates, no seating assignments, no welcome packets, just a black binder at every seat, thick unlabeled and waiting. Barry, the front desk attendant turned executive liaison, was now stationed just outside the boardroom door. He had been reassigned, promoted technically after Jordan witnessed the strength and clarity in his calm refusal to excuse Kevin Slate's negligence. His job now was to manage optics and human integrity. And his first assignment, witness every person who entered that boardroom and observe who looked nervous, who looked entitled, and who looked ready. Inside, Jordan remained standing. He hadn't once taken a seat since the first realignment meeting. His presence alone was enough to command attention, but it was his silence that did the real work. It forced others to fill the air with their own assumptions and often with their own unraveling. Once the last chair was filled, he finally spoke. You've all read the memo, he began. His tone was neutral. Not hostile, not warm, but memos don't change behavior. People do. No one responded. The binders on the table seemed heavier now. You've run this terminal as if service were synonymous with selection, Jordan continued. You've built a culture that rewards optics over outcomes, politeness over fairness, appearances over truth. He paced slowly, his fingertips brushing the edge of the glass table as he walked. You've created a system where a man in a suit is escorted to a lounge without question, but a man in a hoodie, despite being a majority stakeholder in your parent company, gets told to wait outside. Someone cleared their throat, another adjusted their tie. A woman near the far corner glanced at her tablet, but only to escape his gaze. Jordan stopped walking. In your binders are transcripts, he said, nodding to the materials in front of them. Internal emails, comm logs, call recordings. Each one reflects how this team responded to customers based on cues you don't list in any official policy. Tone of voice, accent, dress, name. A man from the hospitality division, a sharp-dressed executive named Malcolm, raised a tentative hand. With respect, Mr. King, some of these aren't violations. They're just practices, industry-wide. Jordan turned to face him fully. That's why I'm not just changing the rules. I'm rebuilding the root system. There was no applause, no affirmation, just the shifting of bodies in their seats, some leaning in with curiosity, others folding their arms with unease. Jordan continued, his voice steady. Today begins phase 2 of the Equity Integration and Human Standards Program. You've seen the outline: unconscious bias, training, client interaction audits, blind resume protocol, language neutrality in promotions. But what matters most is the clause at the back of your binder. All eyes drop to the last page. If you cannot support this shift in culture, Jordan said plainly, you may opt out. Gasps, low murmurs, glances exchanged like currency. Malcolm blinked. Opt out. You'll be offered a severance package, 6 months covered, health care, full letters of recommendation, on the condition that you step down before the transition begins. The weight of the room grew dense. People shifted again, this time with less confidence. This is not punishment, Jordan added. It's clarity. Some of you are excellent at logistics. Some of you run brilliant vendor pipelines. But if your leadership can't reflect equity, you are not right for where we're going. Silence. A woman near the center, Carla Henderson, head of client technology, spoke up. And if we stay, Jordan looked at her, you lead by example. You show your staff that power doesn't dress one way. You build policies that are blind to bias and loyal to merit. You enforce standards that hold character above collar style. She nodded slowly. Then I'll stay. Another voice, so will I. Then another. And another. But not all. At least 4 executives quietly closed their binders. One of them, Darren from Experience Optimization, stood, adjusted his lapels, and gave a stiff nod. This is your vision, not mine, he said. And I'd rather step aside than fake alignment. Jordan didn't blink. You have 30 minutes to clear your office. Barry will process your exit. Darren left the room with quick, clipped steps. The door closed gently behind him. Jordan turned back to the remaining faces. That was a man who couldn't serve a new system without trying to poison it. Let him walk. They sat straighter. Because the reckoning had arrived, and with it, the quiet rebirth of a legacy not built on velvet ropes, but on visible worth. Outside the boardroom, the whispers were no longer about rumors. They were confirmations. Word had spread that several executives, men and women long seen as untouchable, had exited with nothing more than polite nods and cardboard boxes. But what shocked the staff more than the departures was how it had happened. No shouting, no public announcements, no security escorts, just quiet acknowledgments of misalignment and doors gently closing behind them. Barry stood at his desk as one of the last executives from the meeting passed by binder, underarm gaze low. He didn't speak, didn't even nod. Barry didn't expect him to. He had seen the man treat janitors like furniture. Now the echo of his footsteps felt like a lesson delivered in real time. In the maintenance hallway, deeper into the service section of the terminal, 2 custodians were finishing their break. One of them, Andre, a quiet veteran of the night shift, held his coffee with both hands, eyes glued to his phone. You see this? He asked his coworker, showing a memo that had just hit the internal portal. The headline, Behavioral Equity Clause implemented across Luxport. The younger man leaned in, squinting. That real? I thought they just fired a couple of managers. Andre nodded slowly. It's real. They named the guy behind it too. Jordan R. King. Said he's the one who owns us now. There was a long pause between them. The kind of pause that grows from disbelief that something good is actually happening. Andre set his cup down and stood. I've worked here 16 years. Nobody's ever written a policy that had anything to do with us. Back upstairs, Ty, an intern-turned assistant who had escorted the elderly man earlier, was summoned to the East Observation Suite. He moved quickly, clutching his notepad, unsure what to expect. His stomach buzzed with nerves, but it wasn't fear. It was something else, like standing at the edge of a deep shift. Inside, he found Jordan sitting alone, reviewing a digital dashboard of Luxport's compliance metrics data never shown to interns, let alone first-year employees. You asked for me, Sir Jordan looked up, and for the first time Ty saw the weight in his eyes. Not exhaustion, but purpose, aged by patience. Yes, Jordan said. I wanted to ask you something important. Ty swallowed, straightened his back. Of course, Jordan gestured to the seat across from him. When you walked Mr. Wexler into the suite earlier, how did you see him? Ty blinked, surprised. He looked a little lost. Old. Like he didn't know if he belonged here. Jordan nodded, and you helped him anyway. Ty looked unsure. That's what I thought I was supposed to do. That's what you chose to do, Jordan corrected. When someone walks in unsure, most people defer to protocol. You deferred to compassion. Ty said nothing, but his eyes shimmered slightly. You saw the man, not the status, Jordan continued. That's what this entire transition is about. Outside the suite, people were noticing. The badge scanners had been adjusted to no longer default to dress code recognition. AI-based systems now flag patterns of interaction, how long agents spent with certain travelers, which customers were given preferential treatment without documented reasons, and whether facial recognition delays correlated with skin tone variance. These weren't just security upgrades, and they were accountability machines. Inside the central staff lounge, two junior attendants were mid-conversation. You believe the rumors, one asked, that he walked in here in a hoodie and got profiled? The other nodded. I saw the footage. My cousin works security, said the guy didn't raise his voice once. Just watched, then flipped the whole place upside down. But he didn't fire everyone. Nope, the second one said. Just the ones who thought the rules didn't apply to them. In that moment, the idea of VIP shifted from appearance to action. Barry, standing behind the reception desk, watched as one of the first travelers arrived under the new regime. She was older, black, wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat and floral print dress, dragging a single suitcase. Her name wasn't on any press list, nor was her arrival announced in hushed tones by the old concierge team. But Barry recognized the last name. Wexler, the granddaughter maybe, or great-niece. She looked hesitant, already bracing for the kind of welcome she'd likely been taught to expect. Barry stepped from behind the desk. Ms. Wexler. Her eyes widened. Yes. Welcome to Luxport, Barry said with a warm smile. We've been expecting you. And just like that, a small truth landed like thunder. When you recognize the dignity of someone before you recognize their name, you don't need to announce change. You become it. The sun had begun its slow descent outside the frosted glass panels of Luxport's eastern wing, but inside the executive data center, the air was electric. Jordan R. King stood at the edge of a curved touchscreen table that pulsed with soft blue light. On its surface, real-time data bloomed into clusters, patterns of behavior. Digital transcripts, log files, and employee conduct summaries rendered not in rows of numbers but in visual truth. This wasn't guesswork anymore. This was proof. To his left, Ezra Price, Chief Compliance Officer of Onyx Aeroch, watched as the clusters aligned. This system, Ezra said, quietly tapping one node that flashed red, is built on familiarity bias. The same 10 names appear in over 70% of discretionary exceptions. Jordan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The evidence was laid bare. Upgraded rooms offered without cause to visually affluent guests, access denied to others based on tone of voice, travel attire, or ethnic surname pattern recognition. The AI hadn't just confirmed assumptions, it had mapped them. The surveillance logs from the past 90 days painted a damning picture. Employees like Mason Creed hadn't just exercised bias, they had institutional support. Each exception he granted passed without audit. Each dismissal without escalation. He wasn't just an outlier. He was a model of the culture they had quietly built. And it had cost them everything. Ezra leaned in, eyes narrowing on a timeline. This incident, here 5 weeks ago, denied access to a man wearing a non-collared shirt despite platinum clearance. Jordan's voice was quiet. Pulled the footage, yet Ezra tapped twice. A screen came alive. The clip played in silence. A middle-aged black man in his 50s approached the VIP desk, presenting credentials. The staffer, a woman named Hillary, barely looked at him before motioning toward the standard terminal. No escalation, no review, just dismissal. Jordan closed his eyes, not in fatigue, but in recognition. This wasn't new. It was simply now documented. At that moment, his phone buzzed. A message from Ty. Sir, received internal complaints, log you requested. You'll want to see this. Jordan swiped the file open. What he saw wasn't just shocking, it was revolting. Over 300 employee complaints logged over the last 12 months. Of those, nearly half involved claims of unequal treatment, hostile work environment, or retaliatory punishment after whistleblowing. Most were dismissed as interpersonal conflicts. Several had no resolution filed at all. Buried deep in the file was a subfolder labeled Internal Escalations, flagged by AI but overridden by supervisor. Jordan opened the first one. Case 117A, passenger Selena Moore. Complaint discriminatory comment made at security gate. Resolution guest misinterpreted tone. No further action. Jordan tapped on the audio file attached. A clipped voice, nasal and rehearsed. You should try the family terminal, miss. This one's not for, first-timers. There was a pause. Then Selena's voice, steady but shaken. I'm a Fortune 100 executive. This is my 4th flight this month. Silence followed. Jordan looked to Ezra. I want every case reopened. Ezra nodded, already in motion. Elsewhere in the terminal, the landscape of power was quietly shifting. A team of digital ethics specialists flown in under Onyx Aeroch's Equity Integration Protocol had begun interviewing frontline staff. Not managers, not supervisors, just the ones whose voices had never reached the upper floors. In a small glass-paneled room near the security lounge, a baggage handler named Ricardo sat across from an interviewer. His hands fidgeted in his lap. I saw it a lot, he admitted, the double takes, the way we were told to observe more carefully with certain passengers. The interviewer nodded. Were you ever asked to delay a bag intentionally? Ricardo hesitated, then nodded once. Only for non-priority tags. But sometimes those tags, I swear the passengers had the same class of service. Only difference was who was carrying the luggage. Back in the executive suite, Ezra returned with a stack of digital summaries, cross-referenced internal overrides with denied VIP entries. The overlap is chilling. Jordan took the tablet. Name after name scrolled past. Each entry bore the fingerprint of quiet discrimination so subtle it had evaded the formal systems, but not anymore. One entry made him pause. Case 227B, passenger Isaiah Whitaker, age 17. Jordan tapped it. Video playback. A black teenager wearing a Yale hoodie approached the suite gate. His name appeared on the guest list under executive dependent. Priority clearance. The attendant looked at him, glanced back at the list, then said, "You sure this isn't a prank?" Jordan's jaw clenched. Ezra's voice cut in low and cold. He's your godson, isn't he? Jordan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The system had crossed a line too many times. This is no longer about compliance, he said quietly. Ezra nodded. It's about justice. They stood in silence as the weight of what they were uncovering settled like storm clouds overhead. Outside the suite, staff moved through the halls differently now. There was a new gravity in their steps, a fresh sense that someone was watching, not to punish, but to see. What had once been whispered was now being recorded. And what had once been ignored would now be reckoned with. The buzz of fluorescent lights overhead hummed steadily as Jordan R. King stepped into the executive conference hall, now repurposed as a temporary tribunal. The long obsidian table had been cleared of luxury snacks and branded paperweights. In their place sat digital tablets, legal summaries, and personnel files, each containing evidence that would now be addressed face-to-face. Behind him, Ezra Price, Onyx Aeroch's chief compliance officer, carried a black folder tucked under one arm. Ty followed close behind, holding a secure tablet with a locked briefing. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Seated at the table were the figures who had once controlled the tone and tempo of Luxport's elite customer experience. Kevin Slate, now stripped of all executive access, sat with his arms crossed tightly over his chest. To his left was Lila Cromwell, the director of brand standards. On the far right, slouched in a chair that suddenly felt too big for him, sat Ethan Red, head of guest services and author of a dozen professional demeanor protocols, many of which had now been flagged for implicit bias. The room was silent until Jordan placed a leather-bound report on the table. Its gold-embossed title read simply, Institutional Pattern Review, Luxport VIP Division. Jordan didn't sit. He remained standing. You've seen the footage. He began, his voice calm but sharpened by edge. You've read the wings. What you haven't done until now is answer for them. Lila cleared her throat first. Mr. King, we understand that certain interactions were mishandled, but I'd like to clarify that our intent was never discriminatory. Ezra flipped open the folder. Intent doesn't negate impact, he said flatly, and we have over 300 documented incidents in just the past year. 74% involving discretionary denials, all tied to appearance-based assessments. Kevin leaned forward. We had visual protocols in place for guest safety. If someone didn't fit the profile, Jordan's voice cut in low and final. The profile. That's exactly the problem. A click echoed as Ty projected a heat map onto the wall, a glowing visual of incident patterns mapped across time and location. Ezra narrated, "This chart reflects visual denials by time of day and gate assignment. Notice how spikes occur most frequently during early morning hours when executive travel is highest. Now compare that to employee race and attire notes." The image shifted. Blue lines overlapped red clusters. The pattern was undeniable. Jordan stepped closer. You weren't just gatekeeping luxury. You were gatekeeping perception. People were denied access because they didn't look like they belonged. Ethan bristled. Look, you're taking all of this out of context. We had elite clientele to protect. You protected an aesthetic, not people. Jordan snapped, his voice still level, but carrying a thunder beneath its surface. And that aesthetic came with assumptions, racial, socioeconomic, stylistic. I was turned away for wearing a hoodie while holding majority ownership of this facility. Lila tried to pivot. Then let's address it. Let's fix it. Ezra tapped the table. You had years to fix it. You only want to now because your seat is threatened. Silence returned. Behind the frosted glass walls, staff lingered just beyond view. The mood outside was tense. Word had spread fast. This was no ordinary review. This was a reckoning. Ty stepped forward now, offering the secure tablet to Jordan. He glanced at the screen, then looked up at Kevin. Tell me about case 303, Jordan asked. Kevin blinked. I don't. March 14th. A woman named Deja Rowe, Priority Plus member. She arrived early alone and in a green flight jacket. She was redirected to the public waiting area. Kevin fumbled. That must have been a mistake. Maybe she was 7 months pregnant, Jordan said sharply, and carrying a platinum ID issued by the board of Onyx Aeroch. Ezra slid a printed still image across the table. It showed Deja standing at the entrance, visibly distressed, security escorting her away. Jordan stared at Kevin. That wasn't just a guest. That was my sister. Every breath in the room went still. Kevin's lips parted. Mr. King, I swear I didn't know. No, Jordan said, stepping back. You didn't care to know. His gaze swept across the others. That's what this has always been about. You used your positions to curate exclusion. You built an empire of comfort for the familiar, and you punished the unfamiliar in silence. That ends now. He turned to Ezra. Proceed with personnel motions. Level 3 clearance terminations for all supervisory roles implicated in discretionary misconduct. Ezra nodded. Already drafted. Ty sent a final signal from the tablet. Within minutes, security notices would be delivered to the affected staff. Luxport's VIP division was being purged not out of vengeance, but necessity. Jordan looked at the three executives for the last time. Your legacy is not in what you built, but in what you permitted. He turned and left the room. Not with fury, but with finality. Behind him, the old guard remained frozen in their seats, silent, powerless, and exposed. The hallways of Luxport's private client services division no longer echoed with the sound of certainty. Gone were the swift heel clicks of executives rushing to meetings and the forced pleasantries whispered between departments. In their place was a creeping stillness, punctuated by urgent footsteps, whispered speculation, and the occasional sound of a cardboard box sliding across polished tile. Jordan R. King had moved on from the confrontation, but the consequences he set in motion were only beginning to crystallize. Within 30 minutes of his departure from the executive conference room, internal communications went live. Digital IDs began to deactivate in real time. Badge access blinked red at executive suite entrances. Meeting invites disappeared from calendars. Within the hour, 5 senior staff members were gone, terminated quietly but unmistakably. Luxport, once a cathedral to curated affluence, was now under forensic review. Ezra Price, backed by Onyx Aeroch's internal reform task force, assumed operational control. A war room was established on the top floor, a sleek, glass-enclosed space filled with legal analysts, HR reviewers, ethics advisors, and systems engineers. At its center was a massive live dashboard mapping employee behavior metrics, client complaint clusters, and service disparities, all rendered in shifting color codes and timestamps. The data was damning. From VIP escort patterns disproportionately favoring lighter-skinned clients to an unspoken but enforced grooming standard that routinely penalized natural hairstyles, piercings, and attire associated with non-Western cultures, Luxport's vaunted premium service was revealed as a carefully curated ecosystem of bias. Jordan returned to the war room just after 3 to 15 p.m., his presence wordless but commanding. He stood beside Ezra, reviewing a newly flagged cluster of complaints. Gate C4, Ezra said, pointing. Two different travelers denied access to the priority lounge. Both had valid credentials. Both were black. Both filed quiet complaints that were closed without follow-up. Jordan's eyes narrowed. Who handled them? Ezra tapped the screen. Zara Lee, guest experience director. Resigned 30 minutes ago. No notice. HR said she cited stress. Jordan didn't flinch. Pull her incident history. I want every closed complaint reopened and audited. Yes, sir. In the corner, Ty worked rapidly at his terminal, correlating staff demographic data with lounge access logs. A pattern emerged: gate agents frequently denied fast-track entry to guests based on ambiguous claims, overcrowding, technical delays, or safety compliance. These were arbitrary walls invisible to most, but designed to exclude those who didn't visually match a pre-approved mold of VIP. Jordan folded his arms, watching the pattern bloom on the screen. This wasn't a series of mistakes, he said quietly. It was a system of preferences masquerading as policy. Outside the war room, the atmosphere had changed, not just in tone, but in posture. Employees who once thrived on performance theater now moved cautiously, as if the building itself was watching. For many, fear lingered. But for others, there was something else: relief. One of them was Barry. At the front desk, Barry now stood with a new badge clipped neatly to his lapel: Interim Director, Guest Integrity. His face showed the weight of responsibility, but also quiet pride. Jordan had appointed him personally, citing not just loyalty, but moral clarity. Barry's first act was simple but symbolic. He removed the gold-plated standard dress code required placard that had sat beside the check-in tablet for 5 years. In its place, he installed a small glass case holding the old sign, now cracked in one corner. A single plaque rested beneath it: Retired Policy, Retired Prejudice. Inside the staff lounge, a group of frontline employees gathered around their phones, watching the news unfold in real time. Multiple outlets had begun covering the shakeup. Some led with dry headlines: leadership transition at Luxport. Others didn't hold back: CEO denied service. Now he owns the terminal. But the most viral post came from a former employee named Melissa Yu, who had resigned 2 years earlier after filing a complaint against the company for discrimination and receiving a 2-line dismissal letter in response. Melissa's post featured a black and white image of Jordan R. King standing alone outside the terminal, his hoodie drawn up. The caption read, "They told me I didn't look the part. He didn't either. But now he is the part." It was shared over 3 million times in under 48 hours. Back in the war room, Ezra turned to Jordan. "PR is asking if you want to issue a statement." Jordan didn't look up from the screen. "No, nothing." He turned his gaze sharp but calm. "I'm not here to explain the obvious. I'm here to fix what should never have broken." Ezra nodded. Understood. At that moment, the final phase of the transition began. The Onyx Airwatch team deployed their own equity oversight framework into the Luxport ecosystem, a system designed not only to detect bias, but to disassemble it algorithmically. Automated alerts were now tied to guest interactions. If a frontline employee denied a service, the system required a reason, one tied to codified policy, not discretion. Managers were no longer gatekeepers. They were auditors. And for the first time in Luxport's history, the VIP list wasn't prioritized by appearance or assumption, but by behavior, respect, and merit. That night, the terminal glowed with a different kind of light. Jordan R. King stood once again at the Sky Lounge window, looking not at planes but at people. He watched an older black woman being escorted through security, not by obligation, but by invitation. A child with cornrows giggled as a lounge host offered him sparkling water with a bendy straw. A Sikh executive in a navy turban passed through priority check-in without pause. Jordan's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. The system hadn't just been challenged, it had begun to collapse. The sun had set over Halvin International Airport, but inside the executive terminal, the lights glowed with a different clarity: cleaner, quieter, as if they too had taken on the weight of the day's transformation. There was no press conference, no ribbon-cutting ceremony, only the hum of restoration and the soft murmur of a place learning how to become something better. Jordan R. King stood alone on the upper mezzanine, overlooking the departure gates. The crowd below moved with the usual cadence of travel, rolling suitcases, hushed announcements, distant coffee grinders. But if you listened closely, something else echoed in the silence. Accountability, realignment, a correction unfolding not with case, but with composure. Behind him, the now former director of private client services, Kevin Slate, had left the premises hours earlier. Quietly, without resistance. No one had stopped him. No statement had been issued. No press had followed. But the impact of his removal lingered in the atmosphere like the aftertaste of ozone, something sharp and charged that the lungs hadn't quite learned how to process. Downstairs, the new training program had already begun. In a converted lounge space rebranded as the Equity Integration Briefing Suite, a group of staff members sat around a sleek U-shaped table. Among them were hosts, porters, security agents, and even legacy employees who had held titles for over a decade. Gone were the usual onboarding slides about customer service charm and upselling premium packages. This wasn't a presentation. It was a reckoning. On screen was footage uncut, unedited from earlier that morning. Mason Creed dismissing Jordan with a smirk. The laughter. The refusal. The slow-motion rewind of a moment the building had hoped no one important would notice. The trainer didn't pause for commentary. He didn't need to. The silence in the room said enough. Then came Barry. The once soft-spoken front desk agent now stood at the front of the room. His posture was upright, voice steady, eyes locked forward. "I watched it happen," Barry said. "I saw it from the monitor." I hesitated. "And because of that, we failed." The room didn't move. "I used to think silence made me safe," he continued. "That staying quiet meant staying employed. But I was wrong. Silence doesn't protect people like us. It protects the ones who think they're untouchable." He looked down for a moment, collecting himself. This place failed a man, not because it didn't know better, but because it didn't think it had to care. Someone in the back cleared their throat quietly. Another leaned forward, elbows on knees, listening more carefully now. "We don't get to go back," Barry said plainly. "Only forward. And what we do next determines whether we ever deserve trust again." No applause followed, but heads nodded, first slowly, then with intention. In the upper-level conference room, a different meeting was underway. The senior leadership of Luxport, now whittled down to 6, sat across from the 3 new directors appointed by Blackstone Dominion Holdings. At the head of the table sat Jordan, not as a figure of vengeance, but of vision. "We're not interested in cosmetic changes," one of the new directors stated. "This is not a PR cleanse. It's a systems redesign." One executive, a man in his 60s with silver hair and a reputation built on discretion, shifted in his seat. "We'll need time, structural changes at this scale." "You've had time," Jordan interjected calmly. "You chose comfort. This time the timeline belongs to those who were once dismissed." A pause, then agreement. Outside that room, the dominoes continued falling. The VIP corridor, once exclusive in appearance and exclusion, had been fitted with new biometric check-ins, scrubbed of discretionary approval. Dress codes were reworded from professional standard to accessibility, forward presentation reviewed by independent bias auditors. Even the scent profile of the terminal was changed, subtle but intentional. Gone was the bergamot lace leather. In its place, notes of cypress and sage. A nod to new beginnings. As midnight approached, Jordan returned to the place where it had all begun, the bench outside the terminal. The one where he had been dismissed, judged, undervalued. The bench had since been moved, relocated to a place of reflection beside the new legacy wall near the staff entryway. On that wall, engraved in brushed steel, was a single quote: "Respect begins where assumptions end." J.R. King. He sat for a moment, watching the slow sweep of janitorial staff move through the corridors. One of them, a woman in her late 50s wearing creased shoes and humming faintly to herself, caught his eye. She nodded, he nodded back. That was the legacy he wanted. Not power through fear, but change through recognition. A quiet man in a hoodie had walked through the front door and been told he didn't belong. Now he owned the building, but he hadn't stayed to gloat. He had stayed to rebuild. And as planes continued to land, as strangers continued to arrive, Jordan R. King knew that the story of that day would fade from headlines soon enough, but the culture it corrected would endure, because what began as a single act of bias had ended in the rebirth of a system. Barry Williams hadn't always been invisible, but somewhere along the years working the front desk at Halvin International's private terminal, he'd learned how to blend into silence. Watch record, comply. That had been his mantra. A quiet middle-aged man with wireframe glasses and creased slacks, Barry had kept his head down and avoided confrontation. He wasn't there to make waves. He was there to survive the tide. But that morning when Mason Creed dismissed a man who turned out to be the new owner of their entire division, something inside Barry shifted. A quiet kind of fury, not the hot kind that lashes out. The cold kind, the surgical kind that changes people. Now sitting in the break room with a half-empty cup of vending machine coffee, Barry reviewed the footage again, not because he had to, but because he needed to understand it from every angle. Every body language cue, every word choice, every moment of hesitation that had passed like a whisper but landed like a bullet. Around him, murmurs passed between colleagues. Mason's removal had shaken the foundation. Kevin Slate's abrupt resignation had cracked the walls. And now all eyes silent, unsure, were glancing toward Barry, because Barry hadn't stayed quiet. When the new cultural audit launched, he'd volunteered not as a formality, but as a signal. He submitted statements. He testified about patterns he'd observed for years. He admitted to his own inaction, not to earn sympathy, but to draw the line in public view. At 11:30 a.m., he was called into the internal ethics boardroom formerly used for staff, reprimands now rebranded the Clarity Room. Inside were two representatives from Onyx Arach's Integrity Division and a data analyst named Mira Chow. Barry had expected a grilling. Instead, he found listening. "We're not here to punish," Mira had said, calmly adjusting her sleeve. "We're here to understand what the system taught people like you to ignore." Barry didn't speak right away. Then he said, "It taught me that if I questioned a judgment call from someone like Kevin, I'd lose my job. It taught me that people with suits didn't get second-guessed and people in hoodies didn't get second chances." Mira nodded slowly. "Did you believe that? Or did you learn it by watching I believed it?" "Because I watched it work," Barry replied, his voice steady. "I watched guests who looked like Jordan get passed over. I watched complaints get watered down in reports. I watched people like Mason rise not because they were competent, but because they reinforced the image of control." "And you," Mira asked gently, "what did you do with that knowledge I filed reports the right way? I logged every incident I was allowed to log, but I didn't escalate. I didn't push. I told myself I couldn't afford to. I have two sons. One's in college. One's in rehab. I needed the job." The room was quiet. "You still do," Mira said, "and you still have it." Barry's breath caught. He hadn't expected mercy. He hadn't even expected understanding. "But from this point forward," she continued, "your job isn't just to monitor badges and direct guests. It's to speak up, publicly. We need someone with institutional memory to help rebuild trust. You saw the rot. Now you'll help chart the cure." That afternoon, Barry stood in the center of the staff auditorium. Over 60 employees sat before him, from housekeeping to security to concierge agents. The memo had gone out already, mandatory attendance. But what they didn't expect was who would be speaking. Barry stepped up to the podium. No notes, no teleprompter. "My name is Barry Williams," he began, voice steady, clear. "I've worked here for 14 years. I know where the cracks were buried, and I know what it felt like to pretend not to see them." He paused. Some staff leaned forward. "I've watched people get excluded based on how they looked, talked, dressed, and moved. I've watched guests come in with quiet dignity and get denied dignity in return, and I was part of the machine that allowed that." A few in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. "But that ends now," Barry continued. "Not because we're scared of headlines, not because someone in a hoodie turned out to own the place, but because we finally understand what we became. And that knowledge comes with responsibility." He gestured behind him toward a projected slide that read, "Clarity is the first step toward justice. If you've ever thought, it's not my job, I need you to erase that thought," Barry said. "It is your job. It's all of our jobs. This place doesn't need more gatekeepers. It needs witnesses who won't stay silent anymore." The room was quiet, but not dismissive. When Barry stepped down, no one applauded because it wasn't a performance. It was a confession. And for the first time in a long time, he walked back to his desk, not with the stiffness of survival, but the upright confidence of someone who had chosen to see and had chosen to speak. In a corner of the terminal, Jordan R. King stood in the shadows watching from behind a soundproof glass panel. He didn't need to intervene. The system was beginning to correct itself, Jordan R. King stood in front of the panoramic glass of the Luxport Executive Suite, not as a man basking in triumph, but as one preparing for reconstruction. Beneath the surface of authority and poise, his mind worked like an algorithm gathering, sorting, correlating. The cultural rot he had seen was only the front-facing glitch of a deeply embedded flaw in the architecture, and fixing it wouldn't come from just reshuffling personnel or issuing memos. It would require proof documented, undeniable, systemic. He turned toward the tablet in his hand, fingers gliding over encrypted files that had been quietly collecting over the past several months. Jordan hadn't launched this acquisition on a whim. He'd anticipated resistance, coded bias, buried records. What he didn't expect was how blatant it would be even on the day of transition. He opened a secure drive titled Operation Clearview. Inside, folders labeled with timestamps, staff ID codes, badge, swipe logs, guest denial summaries, concierge reclassification entries, and something else, silent reports. Whistleblower statements from internal employees submitted anonymously. Barry wasn't the only one who had seen the cracks. Jordan tapped into the most recent one. Statement 04, filed by Aegis 09. I've worked in this terminal for 7 years. I've watched frontline staff encouraged to enforce unwritten standards, what they call the aesthetic of exclusivity. I've seen the same guest turned away 4 times before he changed his outfit. Once he wore a watch worth $80K, he got full access. None of our policy documents mention attire, but the message is always clear. If they look like they belong, let them in. This place doesn't need new paint. It needs new values. Jordan leaned back slightly, his jaw tightening. That phrase, the aesthetic of exclusivity, was the virus. Elegant, elusive, hard to pin down in a legal document, but potent in its power to exclude. He began voice recording notes. Verify the unspoken dress code patterns. Cross-reference guest admittance records with race attire descriptors in staff assigned. If there's a 70% plus correlation between rejection and perceived informality among non-white guests, we have cause for federal inquiry. He paused and exhaled slowly. Then his phone buzzed. Matthew Rhee, his legal architect, appeared on screen. Jordan, he said, eyes sharp. We just uncovered something deeper. Jordan turned toward the lounge desk, stepping into the privacy of a recessed alcove. Talk to me. Remember Mason Creed? Matthew asked. Jordan said nothing. He didn't need to confirm. Well, he wasn't just enforcing bias. He was part of what looks like an internal scoring system for brand-aligned guests. It was off the books. A shadow protocol used by the old client services head. Jordan's face hardened. What kind of scoring? Facial recognition, overlays analyzed against past luxury check-in data. The AI flagged certain guests as likely high value based on posture, attire, facial grooming, and estimated net worth extracted from public photo indexing. Skin tone wasn't a listed input, but the bias bled through in the pattern. Those marked below 75 were often deferred to general terminal access. Mason's phrase, not ours. How many guests were flagged under 75 in the last year? Jordan asked coldly. 372. Of those, 86% were black or brown. Less than 4% received upgrades. Most never returned. Jordan let the silence sit. Then, this is no longer a personnel issue. This is now algorithmic bias with operational endorsement. Archive every instance. Prepare a white paper. I want this sent to the Ethics Council of the National Aviation Consortium. Matthew nodded. You got it. Jordan ended the call. Across the hallway, Barry appeared outside the suite with a small black folder. He paused, waiting for permission. Jordan nodded once. Barry entered. I thought you'd want to see this, he said quietly. It's a copy of the original guest profiling manual used before Luxport migrated their systems. We weren't supposed to keep physical records. Jordan opened the folder. Inside were laminated sheets from 5 years ago, color-coded guest tiers, desirability scores, visual screening heuristics. It was damning. You kept this? Jordan asked. Barry hesitated. I almost shredded it, but part of me knew someone would need to remember. Jordan nodded with a rare flicker of approval. Good, because we're not just building a case for reform, we're building the blueprint for what replaces this. He turned toward the window once more. The tarmac glinted under a harsh sun, but inside the chill of revelation cut deeper than any winter wind. They had the data. They had the witnesses. They had the history. Now it was time to make the system confess. The boardroom at the Luxport Executive Wing was colder now, not from the thermostat, but from the tension that coiled in the air like a titan spring. Jordan R. King stood at the head of the obsidian glass table, and across from him sat the remaining directors of the old guard figures, who had once ruled with polished smiles, unchallenged preferences, and quiet inherited power. The lights were dim, the blinds partially drawn. Outside the window, a light drizzle began to trace down the glass in slow, trembling rivulets, as though the weather itself understood the gravity of what was unfolding inside. Jordan set a hardbound dossier on the center of the table. It echoed slightly on the glass. Inside it were 37 pages, each documenting a denial, a profiling incident, or an internal communication riddled with code phrases like "not our aesthetic, unverified luxury," and "referral-only discretion." Each page had names, timestamps, actions, inactions. Some even included photos discreetly captured by whistleblowers from within the company. He didn't speak at first. He let the silence hang like a gavel suspended above the table. Then he began. "You didn't see me when I walked through that door," Jordan said quietly. "But I saw you. I saw this entire institution." His voice was even. His posture relaxed, but there was steel behind every syllable. "You've built a machine that runs not on efficiency, not on luxury, but on perception. The problem is perception has a bias, and yours has been running unchecked for years." One of the board members, Raymond Allard, the vice president of client architecture, shifted uncomfortably and tried to interject. "Mr. King, with respect, it's a stretch to imply malicious intent behind brand preservation. Every luxury service maintains discretion to protect its environment." Jordan's gaze turned on him. "I'm not implying, I'm stating. Your version of discretion is exclusion dressed in linen and leather, and I have 372 documented exclusions to prove it." He flipped open the dossier. The first page bore a name, Kendra L. Harmon, denied lounge access, downgraded to general terminal, despite Tier 1 verification. Ms. Harmon is a tech investor, current net worth $480 million, denied access because, and I quote from the internal note, "guest presented unverified persona and mismatched aesthetic." That mismatch was a head wrap and a backpack. Everything else on her profile was in order. Jordan's tone sharpened like a blade pulling from a sheath. "She left. She never returned. She also sits on the board of a hospitality investment group that was reviewing your expansion project in Qatar." Guess which way their vote went? The room was still. Elliot Van, the executive from Strategic Partnerships, coughed softly, trying to recalibrate the conversation. "So what now?" he asked. "Are we being asked to resign?" Jordan didn't blink. "I'm not asking. I'm dismantling." A murmur rippled across the room, the kind that carried both panic and disbelief. But Jordan wasn't finished. "I've triggered a full audit, legal, operational, and cultural. Every executive decision in the last 36 months that involved guest experience is under review. Any overlap between policy and profiling will be exposed." He turned slightly and gestured to the young assistant behind him, Ty, who stepped forward and handed each board member a sleek, sealed envelope. Inside, formal notices of temporary suspension, pending inquiry, and a clause outlining the transition to a new interim leadership council approved by Blackstone Dominion Holdings. Jordan continued, voice unshaken. "You thought turning me away was harmless. Routine, a dress code call. What you didn't realize was that it wasn't just me. It never was. You've turned away investors, innovators, heads of state in disguise, artists, scientists, anyone who didn't dress to your assumptions. And now you've turned away the very future of your brand." He stepped closer to the table. "This isn't about punishment. It's about precedent. And today that precedent changes." The older man at the end of the table, Gerald Shaw, former CEO emeritus, leaned forward. His voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but disbelief. "You think you can erase decades of curated legacy with a dossier?" Jordan looked at him, the light catching just enough of his face to make his expression unmistakable. "No," he said, "but I can expose what that legacy cost." Then slowly he placed the final page on the table. It was a signed approval for the Luxport Visual Screening Protocol dated 7 years ago and authorized by none other than Gerald Shaw himself. The silence after that was unbreakable. Outside, the drizzle had turned into a steady rain. A plane lifted off into the sky beyond the window, its lights piercing the gray. Inside, the Luxport legacy collapsed, not with a shout, not with a scandal, but with proof and a man who had finally decided to stop letting appearance dictate worth. The fallout was immediate. Luxport's executive communications system lit up like a command center under siege. Private Slack channels blinked with panicked threads. Email inboxes overflowed with unread flags. Confidential folders once locked behind encryption layers and restricted access were now open to auditors, their contents under active scrutiny by legal teams dispatched by Blackstone Dominion Holdings. For years, Luxport had operated behind a velvet curtain of exclusivity. But now every thread of that curtain was being yanked down bit by bit until the scaffolding of bias that held the system upright began to tremble. By 3:00 p.m., 7 department heads had been placed on administrative leave. The internal HR dashboard flagged over a dozen Level 3 incidents cases that had been closed with generic justifications like client confusion, appearance, mismatch, or the most common preservation of brand standard. These terms now carried weight like evidence in a courtroom. A quiet power vacuum opened at the top. But Jordan R. King didn't move to fill it with chaos. He moved with precision. In a back conference room turned operations command center, his core team worked in silence, their laptops glowing beneath dimmed ceiling lights. Each team member had a list divided by department, ranked by influence, flagged by past behavior. Jordan stood behind them, his hands in his pockets, surveying the digital battlefield. "We're not destroying the house," he said calmly. "We're replacing the foundation." Across the table, his legal strategist nodded. "Phase 2 implementation begins in 12 hours. We've drafted letters for reappointment, transition, and exit. Do you want to review before they go out?" Jordan shook his head. "No. Send them. If we wait for everyone to get comfortable, we'll end up reinforcing the same walls." Another assistant turned toward him. "We've received anonymous statements, internal whistleblowers. Some of them were trying to push change quietly. Others? Well, they're trying to switch sides now." Jordan raised an eyebrow but said nothing for a long beat. "Then simply document their efforts. Let actions speak louder than their hindsight." From the corridor, murmurs echoed, employees passing by, the occasional footsteps of displaced executives. The tap of distant key cards denied access as digital locks changed in real time. In the executive lounge, a symbolic moment played out. Kevin Slate returned not out of entitlement, but disorientation. He stepped into the lounge cautiously, his hands clasped behind his back. The space had changed. The hosts were different. The energy was colder, sharper. The same carpet, same walls, but the tone had been rewritten. He approached the concierge desk where Ty, the newly promoted floor director, stood reviewing the day's new protocol files. Ty didn't flinch when he saw Kevin. He didn't smile either. "Ty," Kevin's voice wavered. "Can I speak to Mr. King?" Ty lifted his eyes. "He's not receiving you." Kevin tried to compose himself. "Just 2 minutes." Ty shook his head gently. "You had years. It wasn't a dismissal. It was a verdict." Kevin stepped back slowly. He understood. Outside the suite, the walls that had once shielded prejudice now radiated transparency. Screens displayed new metrics, guest satisfaction tallies not tied to attire, loyalty indicators that measured consistency of service, not cosmetic presentation. The overhaul wasn't just aesthetic. It was structural. Meanwhile, Mason Creed was escorted through the security gate he once guarded. This time without his badge, without his voice, without his audience. Corporate security didn't parade him out. There was no announcement. Just 2 plainclothes officers, a black envelope containing termination paperwork, and the unspoken understanding that the system no longer shielded him. He passed Barry, the receptionist, on the way out. For a moment, Mason paused, eyes flicking toward him in a faint, broken attempt at recognition. Barry didn't return it. Instead, he focused on the screen in front of him, where a new internal memo blinked. "Dignity cannot be negotiated. It must be ensured." Elsewhere, the broader aviation network rippled with news of the shakeup. Emails titled "Urgent Luxport Protocol" updates arrived in inboxes at airports in Geneva, Singapore, Dubai, and Los Angeles. Affiliate lounges were instructed to halt all visual screening discretion policies pending legal review. Legacy staff trained under the previous bias-based model were required to attend emergency retraining within 48 hours or risk reassignment. Jordan R. King, meanwhile, returned to the floor. Not to gloat, not to lecture, to lead. He walked the perimeter of the VIP suite, pausing to greet new hires, offering firm handshakes, measured nods, quiet observations. He didn't give long speeches, but everyone watched him like a compass. His presence no longer needed credentials. It was the credential. At 600 p.m. in the privacy of the new strategy room, Jordan took one final meeting that day. An elderly woman entered slowly, her hair pulled back neatly, her posture dignified despite the soft limp in her gait. She wore a beige coat and held a letter in one hand. She had been a lounge staff supervisor 30 years ago. Retired quietly after filing a discrimination complaint that had vanished into corporate red tape. Jordan greeted her with both hands, ushered her to a chair, and listened. She didn't ask for anything. She just wanted to say she'd waited 3 decades to see this day. Jordan nodded solemnly. "We owe you more than justice," he said. "We owe you an apology." As the sun dipped behind the tarmac and the glass walls turned into mirrors, reflecting the inside, one truth became undeniable. Luxport didn't collapse. It transformed. And from its old foundation, a new architecture of dignity had begun to rise. The conference room's lights dimmed slightly as the sun outside faded behind a thick layer of clouds. Inside, the tension was no longer hidden. It hung in the air like static before a storm. Kevin Slate sat motionless in the leather chair at the end of the table, his fingers laced tightly together, knuckles pale. Jordan R. King remained standing, composed as ever, his silence more potent than any reprimand. Behind him, the Onyx Aeroch compliance officer, Elliot Monroe, still had the playback paused on his tablet. The screen showed 2 distinct images, Mason Creed laughing with a fellow guard, and the manifest on which Jordan's name had been flagged and then ignored. The evidence was no longer anecdotal. It was procedural failure turned into prejudice. Kevin tried to speak. There's more to this than you're seeing. I didn't make that call alone. But you endorsed it, Jordan said coolly, turning to face him again. You fostered an environment where appearance overrides protocol, where names don't matter if they don't match a certain image. Kevin's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Jordan took a slow breath, then pulled a document folder from the end of the table and slid it in front of him. Inside was more than just termination paperwork. It was an annotated report, a timeline of incidents, comments, and policy infractions under Kevin's leadership. Some were major, others subtle, but each pointed to a clear pattern: selective access enforcement, unrecorded rejections, appearance-based classifications. It wasn't a single mistake. It was a structure designed, operated, and protected. Jordan remained standing, watching as Kevin flipped through the pages with growing dread. You've created a culture, Jordan said, voice low, firm. Not just a mistake, a system, a signal to your staff that dignity can be assessed with a glance. But that's not, Kevin started, his voice cracking. That's not what I meant. You don't have to mean it, Jordan replied. You just have to allow it. Across the room, Barry entered quietly and handed a sealed envelope to Elliot Monroe, then stepped back. Barry's eyes met Kevin's, only for a moment, just long enough for Kevin to realize that the loyalty he'd once assumed was gone. The staff had seen it all, now had heard the silence, and drawn their own conclusions. And none of them were in Kevin's favor. Elliot opened the envelope and nodded slightly before placing it on the table. Per board approval, he said, you are being released from your duties, effective immediately. Your clearance has been revoked. An escort will accompany you to collect any personal items from your office. Kevin stared at the envelope like it was radioactive. I gave everything to this place, he said hoarsely. I built this terminal's brand from the ground up. Then you know exactly what was built into its foundations, Jordan said. And now you know why it's coming down. No anger, no shouting, just precision. A scalpel, not a hammer. A quiet knock came from the glass doors. 2 private security officers entered. They weren't in uniform, just charcoal gray suits with silver pins, but their presence made the message clear. One stepped forward, nodding toward Kevin. The other remained near the door, professional and silent. Kevin stood slowly, every movement deliberate, the weight of his fall pressing on each limb. As he reached for the folder in front of him, Jordan placed one hand over it. You won't need that, Jordan said. It's already been archived. You no longer own the narrative. Kevin looked around the room one last time at Jordan and at Elliot, at the security officers waiting to escort him out. Then at Barry, who stood a few feet behind with an unreadable expression. No one moved to stop him. No one offered a word of comfort. He straightened his jacket, squared his shoulders, and walked out. The doors clicked shut behind him. The silence that followed was profound. Jordan turned back to the others at the table. This doesn't end with a termination, he said. This ends when perception stops being policy. There were no objections. The leadership team knew the tide had shifted. There would be no return to business as usual. What came next would not be a rebranding. It would be a full reckoning. Jordan looked out the windows once more. Beyond the runway, a small private jet had just landed, its black frame sleek against the golden light breaking through the clouds. A new day was coming, not just for Luxport, but for every system built on shallow recognition and visual gatekeeping. And this time the change wouldn't wear a name tag or a tailored suit. It would wear clarity, permanence, truth. The security officers flanking Kevin Slate didn't touch him. They didn't have to. The quiet rhythm of their steps beside him was enough to mark his fall from grace. Each stride echoed down the executive hallway, polished shoes against glass-tiled floors, the once familiar environment now cold, sterile, and unwelcoming. Kevin's face was tight, but not in resistance, rather in disbelief. His mind replayed every decision, every instant he'd allowed Mason Creed's biases to go unchecked, every time he'd dismissed Barry's quiet hesitations, every shrug he gave to voices he should have heard. His fingers trembled faintly at his side, but he refused to let them clench. Dignity, even if forced, was all he had left. As the elevator doors slid open, Barry stood silently behind the front desk. Their eyes met for only a moment, enough to communicate what no performance review or staff meeting ever could. Kevin looked away first. On the executive floor above, Jordan R. King remained in the boardroom, facing a panel of senior managers who now sat more upright than they had minutes earlier. Gone were the crossed arms and skeptical brows. The weight of reality had settled in. "Let's begin," Jordan said, his tone sharp but not cruel. "From this moment forward, Luxport is under new directive, one that evaluates performance, not presentation. I want all hiring access and service criteria re-audited within 10 business days. Every policy that allows for discretion without written parameters is to be flagged." He turned to the head of HR, a woman in her late 40s with steel gray eyes and a once comfortable distance from operational bias. "I need names," he continued, "not of those who failed quietly, but those who watched and did nothing." Silence enabled the rot. She nodded, lips pursed. For the first time in her career, she understood that neutrality was no longer an option. The memo from earlier that day had already set the tone. We are not eliminating jobs. We are eliminating attitudes. The ripple effect had begun. Outside, the public announcement monitors updated again. A single slide appeared: integrity is not tailored. It's chosen. Inside the private terminal lounge, the energy was different. Staff members now moved with a tense awareness, as if the walls themselves had begun listening. Elliot, the young receptionist who had welcomed Jordan hours earlier with hesitant professionalism, now stood behind the check-in podium, posture tall and alert. He wasn't scared, he was inspired. Watching what had unfolded had changed something in him. Power didn't have to shout. It didn't have to come with flashing badges or booming voices. Sometimes it arrived in a hoodie and left in a tailored suit after rewriting the foundation of an entire system. In one of the smaller briefing rooms just off the corridor, two mid-level managers stood watching a silent replay of Mason's dismissal. It had been captured by internal security, a formality really, but now treated as a lesson. "Can't believe they actually fired him," one whispered. The other, more thoughtful, replied, "He wasn't fired for one mistake. He was fired for being the system's mirror. They just couldn't look away anymore." Back on the main terminal floor, whispers had turned to questions. Travelers had begun noticing small changes: employees who once ignored now greeted. Lounge hosts who once screened now scanned accurately. Escorts who once looked down their nose now looked into people's eyes. In less than 6 hours, Luxport's culture had pivoted, not perfectly, not permanently, but undeniably. Jordan stood outside the executive briefing suite, now leaning against a wall of frosted glass. He scrolled through his phone. The legal team had confirmed the final sign-off. Mason's employment record had been flagged with notation, but without media scandal. Kevin's severance had been voided under the ethics clause he himself had authored. Every measure was silent surgical. But the next move wouldn't be. He called Jeremiah. "I want press access to the footage," he said plainly. "You sure?" Jeremiah asked. "We handled this internally. Could leave it at that." Jordan didn't hesitate. "They'll bury it in a week unless we anchor it in public memory. This isn't just about Luxport, it's about every terminal, boardroom, and lobby where worth is judged at first glance." A pause. "Okay," Jeremiah said. "I'll have it edited clean. Minimal branding." Just the moment he said, "You made a decision based on how I looked, not who I was." Jordan nodded. That's the headline. By evening, the video had already been clipped and circulated through a network of diversity advocates, leadership forums, and professional equity channels. No names were mentioned. No faces exposed except one Jordan's in full command, in quiet truth. Within hours, More Than Appearance was trending across LinkedIn and corporate networks. Emails began flooding Luxport's inbox, some of praise, some of critique, but all engaged. Other terminals requested access to Jordan's new training protocols. Executives across industries scheduled their own culture reviews. And in one small airport in Georgia, an anonymous operations manager forwarded the clip to their CEO with a single note: "This is what accountability looks like." The following morning, the sun broke clean through the misted skyline over Halvin International Airport. For the first time in days, there was clarity not just in the weather, but in the air between people. A shift had occurred, not abrupt, not loud, but irreversible. Inside the Luxport Executive Terminal, a new rhythm was forming. Not a faster one, a more conscious one. At the front desk, Elliot now stood behind a revised podium. It had been subtly altered overnight, smaller, lower, with a new etched plaque reading, "Identity is not appearance." It wasn't just signage, it was a declaration. Elliot was one of many staff members who had received the newly issued handbook that morning, an 18-page document titled Human Standards Protocols Dignity First. Unlike the bloated corporate jargon of before, this document was simple, sharp, and intentional. Each page addressed one thing, treating people like people, not profiles. In the staff break room, a group of employees sat in silence reading it. They weren't being forced. They weren't watching a training video. They were reading by choice, page by page, paragraph by paragraph. "I didn't realize how blind we were," one attendant whispered. Another nodded. "We weren't blind. We just weren't looking." Upstairs in the operations command wing, the leadership vacuum left by Kevin Slate had already been filled unofficially but powerfully. Barry. Barry, the once dismissed receptionist who had spent years quietly observing, correcting, advising, had now been invited into the inner circle. He stood near the executive boardroom with a digital tablet in his hand, taking inventory of newly submitted suggestions from frontline workers. All suggestions were anonymous. All were mandatory to review. One policy Jordan had already implemented: decisions about service experience would no longer be made solely by people who'd never handed someone a boarding pass. The new command structure was clear. Service feedback began from the ground, not the top. Inside the boardroom, Jordan R. King stood in front of a large screen displaying audit heat maps visuals that showed which Luxport terminals had the most complaints tied to appearance bias. The colors flared hot red in urban hubs, cool blue in quieter markets. "It's not about bad actors," Jordan said to the executive panel seated behind him. "It's about bad systems that protect them." He paced slowly, his voice even but firm. This wasn't just Mason or Kevin. This was a culture that trained them to believe discretion was a synonym for judgment. "We're not here to fire everyone. We're here to rewrite the rules." Elliot Van, the previously defensive VP, sat near the window with a notepad. For once, he was writing more than he was speaking. Jordan noticed it but didn't call it out. Change didn't require applause. It required momentum. Back in the main concourse, a woman in a sari approached the VIP check-in. She looked hesitant. Traveling alone for the first time. Her English was accented, her documents worn. Elliot, standing behind the podium, noticed the shift in her eyes, uncertainty, the instinct to prepare for resistance. He smiled warmly and stepped out from behind the desk. "Good morning, ma'am. May I help you with your bag?" he said. The woman blinked, surprised, then nodded. It wasn't grand, it wasn't revolutionary, but it mattered. Down in Terminal C, Jordan moved through the public concourse unannounced, unguarded, unnoticed. The tailored suit was gone again, replaced with a simple gray sweatshirt, black jeans, and running shoes. A soft baseball cap covered his head. He blended in. But this time, he didn't need to stand out. He passed unnoticed by travelers, some rushing, some waiting, some scrolling. A young boy looked up from his tablet and smiled at him. Jordan smiled back and kept walking. He stopped briefly at a newsstand kiosk where digital boards now showed top headlines. One of them read, CEO quietly replaces entire VIP terminal, leadership after appearance-based discrimination. Another from a smaller business ethics publication was simpler. He didn't argue at the gate, he bought the gatekeepers. Jordan paused, then moved on. His phone buzzed once in his pocket. A message from Jeremiah. Press request climbing. Do you want to go public or stay silent? Jordan stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed, neither. Let the actions speak. Prepare the next site audit. We're not done. He put the phone away and stepped onto the moving walkway, hands in his pockets. Overhead, a new automated announcement echoed through the terminal. Luxport welcomes all passengers with dignity. Discretion is no longer subjective. Thank you for holding us accountable. Passengers didn't stop walking, but some turned their heads. Others nodded quietly. A few employees near the gates looked at each other and smiled. They knew who had written that announcement. They knew why it mattered. One level above, in a viewing gallery where families waited to watch departing planes, an elderly man with a cane looked down at the concourse and saw Jordan walking calmly through the crowd. He nudged his granddaughter beside him. See that man, he said? That's what real power looks like. She didn't understand yet, but one day she would. By the close of the week, a quiet storm had made its way through Halvin International Airport, unseen by most travelers, but deeply felt by everyone on the inside. The subtle systems that had once governed who got escorted, who got ignored, and who got silently turned away were no longer intact. Not because someone updated a training video, but because someone rewrote the story. Jordan R. King hadn't granted interviews. He hadn't posed for cameras. There were no viral speeches or press conferences. His strategy wasn't visibility, it was impact. The kind that didn't need to announce itself because everyone could feel the shift. From the top floor boardrooms to the employee locker rooms, the new phrase that had begun circulating was, "We see you now." No slogans, no marketing department, just whispered acknowledgments between janitors, gate agents, and security officers who had once felt invisible themselves. At 10:03 a.m., a memo was pushed live across every Luxport-owned terminal. Its title, Phase 2, Dignity Infrastructure Rollout. It wasn't corporate fluff, it was a blueprint. Terminal design would change. Uniform guidelines were being reassessed. Hiring pipelines were opening to overlooked communities. Security footage would now be audited, not just for threats, but for patterns of disregard. Every lounge, every checkpoint, every corner was now under review, not for efficiency, but for fairness. Inside Luxport's internal messaging platform, hundreds of anonymous employees responded with comments. Many praised the effort. A few were nervous, some were angry, but nearly all agreed on one thing: they had never seen this level of structural correction move so fast. And at the center of it all, Jordan R. King. But on that Friday afternoon, Jordan wasn't in a meeting room or reviewing reports. He was in a city park just 2 miles from the airport, seated on a bench beneath a willow tree. Dressed simply again, back in joggers and a black windbreaker, he blended into the calm like he'd always belonged there. Beside him sat an old friend, Amari Wells, a former aerospace engineer who'd retired after decades of helping design defense flight systems. Amari had mentored Jordan back in his 20s when he was still struggling to find investors who didn't flinch at his face or question his credentials. Now they sat quietly with coffee in hand, watching a few ducks move across a still pond. "You always had that look," Amari said with a chuckle. "The one that made people underestimate you right before you rewrote their rulebook." Jordan smiled faintly. "That look paid off this week." Amari nodded. "I read about it. The boy who got laughed at over a hoodie now writes airport policy. Funny world." Jordan's expression grew thoughtful. "It's not funny yet. Not until it's normal. Not until people like Mason Creed stop being the default gatekeepers." "You fired him?" Jordan shook his head. "No, I removed him. He fired himself the moment he judged someone based on fabric and silhouette." Amari sipped his coffee. "So what now?" Jordan glanced out at the water. "Now I build what wasn't there when I started. A system where power doesn't depend on appearance, only on ability. Back at the terminal, a different kind of transformation was taking root. Near Gate E5, two security officers stood reviewing live footage from the checkpoint cameras. Not for threats, but for body language, for ignored greetings, for patterns of microaggression. They were training themselves, rewiring the muscle memory of dismissal. At the Luxport Training Center, a class of new hires watched as a facilitator projected footage from three incidents, none violent, none explosive, but each telling. One showed a guard checking a white businessman's ID and immediately escorting him through. The next clip showed a black woman in a tailored suit being asked for secondary verification. Notice the posture shift, the facilitator said. Notice how assumptions rewrite process in real time. No one looked away. No one dismissed it as coincidence. In the HR department, the old file for Kevin Slate sat archived, stamped, completed, no contest. He hadn't appealed. He hadn't returned. Rumor had it he was interviewing with a private charter firm across the country, one that had recently come under scrutiny for similar issues. Jordan had already flagged the firm for audit quietly. Elsewhere in the city, Mason Creed had vanished from LinkedIn. No updates, no selfies, no statements. His digital footprint had gone quiet, and still Jordan said nothing publicly. He didn't need to. The work was speaking louder than any press release ever could. At 6:14 p.m., just as golden hour bled across the sky, a new message appeared on Luxport's digital display boards. Every seat is earned. Every face deserves dignity. Welcome to the future of travel. Some passengers noticed. Others didn't. But the employees, they saw everything. A young janitor paused mid-mop, stared at the message, and nodded to himself. A TSA agent in training quietly texted his mother, "I think I'm working somewhere that finally gets it." At that same moment, Jordan returned to the terminal through the main entrance. No VIP corridor, no private escort. Just a man with a boarding pass and a name. He didn't need an introduction. Now the doors opened automatically, not because of recognition, but because the system had finally learned to see. The sun dipped beneath the skyline as twilight cast a soft amber hue across the airfield. Inside Halvin International, the usual rhythms of travel continued. Boarding announcements, rolling luggage, children fussing, executives murmuring into headsets. But something had changed. A stillness moved beneath the surface, a recalibration. Where once there had been hierarchy built on perception, there now pulsed a new awareness. Dignity wasn't a dress code. It was a right. Jordan R. King stood in the center of the main concourse, surrounded by it all. He wore no badge of power, just a dark charcoal coat, clean slacks, and the quiet demeanor of a man who no longer needed to explain who he was. His presence rippled without effort. Some recognized him now, though many still didn't. But that was the point. Respect wasn't supposed to be earned by recognition. It was owed by default. He made his way toward a small service corridor tucked between Gate 12 and the VIP lounge. Waiting there was Terrence Gould, Chief Integration Officer for Onyx Aeroach, tasked with overseeing the final stages of the Luxport acquisition. Terrence stood with a tablet in one hand and tension in his jaw. When he spotted Jordan, he straightened instantly. "They're ready for the walkthrough," Terrence said. Jordan nodded once, not breaking stride. "Let's see it." Together they entered the East Operations Wing, previously restricted to the highest-ranking Luxport executives. Now it was under reconstruction. Not in marble or tile, but in principle. A new initiative labeled OIS for Operational Integrity Standards was being quietly rolled out across all Luxport facilities. Its purpose was twofold: dismantle bias-based decision-making and embed equitable accountability in every layer of employee interaction, from concierge to security. Terrence opened the glass door to a training observation room where a small group of staff sat before a curved display wall showing simulated scenarios. The footage rolled a black woman in business attire requesting lounge access. The original policy flagged her for additional verification. Now in the revised protocol, AI-assisted check-in allowed verification in under 2 seconds, flagging the previous behavior as unjustified discretionary delay. Jordan watched silently. A second simulation played. A young man in sneakers and a hoodie approached the VIP lane. The system didn't blink. With new behavioral parameters in place, there were no escalations, no dismissals, just neutral confirmation of credentials. Behind them, the instructor, a soft-spoken analyst named Zuri Keating, stepped up. "We're still refining the feedback loop," she said. But we're seeing 83% reduction in appearance-based delays and almost total removal of discretionary override abuse. Jordan didn't smile, but his eyes held something deeper focused commitment. Keep going, he said quietly. Normalize it until it doesn't feel revolutionary anymore. Zuri nodded, but her voice lowered. We had someone quit last night. Said they didn't sign up to be policed for their gut instincts. Jordan raised an eyebrow. They weren't fired. No, sir, they resigned. Good, Jordan said. That's how we clean house, by inviting reflection and letting the unteachable walk themselves out. Down the hall in a separate debrief room, two newly hired staff reviewed case files from the previous week's incident logs. They weren't analyzing threats or contraband, but patterns, who got stopped, who didn't, and how that lined up against internal bias tracking tools embedded in their observation system. The software wasn't just watching passengers anymore. It was watching staff behavior too. One of the new employees, Kamal, turned to his partner. This job feels different, doesn't it? Yeah, she said. Feels like we're not just moving bodies anymore. Feels like we're undoing something. In the executive admin wing, Barry, the once overlooked receptionist, now sat in a new role, guest relations lead, part of the equity pilot program, initiated by Jordan's transition team. His desk wasn't just a checkpoint now, it was a listening post. That afternoon, he'd quietly taken notes from 5 interactions that didn't violate policy, but still didn't sit right. He was compiling them in a report called Moments That Matter, a new tool designed to surface subtle disrespect that policies often ignored. Jordan later stopped by Barry's desk, leaning in just slightly. You good? Barry nodded. Better than I've been in years. Jordan looked at the digital binder open on his screen. You're building the blueprint. Barry looked up startled. I'm just trying to do it right. Jordan placed a hand on the desk, firm but encouraging. That is doing it right. By 8:42 p.m., news had already begun circling the industry. A leaked internal document titled The Jordan Protocol had surfaced, outlining the structural audits, cultural realignment initiatives, and zero-tolerance thresholds now redefining Luxport under Onyx Aeroch. Some praised it. Others scoffed, calling it overreach disguised as reform. But one airport executive at a rival firm reportedly said during a private call, if we don't adapt, we'll lose to whoever writes policy with that man. And he was right, because Jordan hadn't just bought a terminal or a luxury service company. He had reprogrammed the invisible rules. The old ones whispered in dress codes and gatekeeping smirks. The new ones were quiet too, but sharper, built not on appearances but on proof. He didn't redesign the system to favor people like him. He redesigned it to stop punishing them. The lights above Halvin International Airport shimmered like stars captured in glass. At Gate 17, a final boarding call echoed for a flight to Johannesburg. Somewhere beyond the public eye, past VIP lounges and administrative wings, Jordan R. King stood at the edge of the tarmac, the cool night wind brushing the edges of his tailored coat. The transformation was complete, not in marble or headlines, but in how the air moved around him. No longer a man mistaken. Now a name engraved into a system he'd rebuilt from the inside. Behind him, the Luxport terminal pulsed with a quiet new rhythm. No grand unveiling, no applause, just changed behavior. Subtle but permanent. He turned back one last time. Inside, the main floor screen still displayed the words, "True service sees beyond appearances." The message had gone viral, not because it was dramatic, but because it was overdue. Airport terminals across the country had begun to inquire about adopting the Jordan Protocol. A LinkedIn post about Luxport's overnight equity overhaul had received over 3 million impressions in 36 hours. News outlets called it the most peaceful revolution in modern hospitality. But that wasn't the story Jordan cared about. The story he focused on was smaller. It was the story of a young man named Elliot, the new host at the private Sky Suite, who once nervously asked if Jordan needed an escort. He didn't. But Jordan remembered how Elliot looked him in the eyes, didn't flinch, didn't assume, just served. That's the real shift, Jordan thought. Not in systems, but in instincts. In the staff canteen earlier that day, Elliot had been asked by a coworker if he was nervous about the new leadership. He'd replied honestly, no. I've only ever judged people by how they treat the janitor. In another hallway, Mason Creed sat alone waiting for his final HR exit interview. He wasn't handcuffed. He wasn't smeared online. There was no lawsuit, no scandal, just silence. A controlled exit. Jordan had insisted on that not out of mercy but message. The new system didn't need to humiliate to correct. It needed to reveal. Across the concourse, Barry was finishing his shift. The once muted receptionist now ran a rotating mentorship program for entry-level employees focused on recognition without assumption. Twice a week, he led listening sessions. No managers, no hierarchy, just people unpacking how it felt to be unseen. Jordan's changes had inspired more than training programs. They had rewritten the DNA of service culture, and yet the man responsible didn't seek the spotlight. Now walking toward the private hangar, his shoes quiet against the pavement, Jordan checked his phone one last time. A message from his legal chief Ezra awaited him. Industry meeting next week. FAA wants to discuss rolling Jordan protocol nationally. He locked the screen and slid it back into his coat. Not yet, he thought. Change wasn't finished here. He reached the door of his private jet. Before stepping in, he paused. A maintenance crew passed by one of them, a black woman with oil-streaked coveralls and hair tied back under a thick cap, looked up and nodded. She didn't know who he was. She just nodded. He nodded back. Respect unprompted, not earned, just given. He stepped inside the aircraft. Inside, the lights were dim calm. A tray of ginger tea waited at his seat, his preferred drink. But no one had asked this time. They had just known. The flight attendant smiled. "Welcome aboard, Mr. King." He replied simply, "Thank you." As the door closed behind him and the engine began its quiet climb to readiness, Jordan looked out the small, round window. The terminal was growing smaller, distant but not detached. The work would continue. Not in headlines, but in habits. This wasn't about punishing a man for not recognizing power. It was about redefining power entirely. The suit, the card, the name on the manifest, none of that should have been necessary, but it was. Because for far too long, people had been trained to see power only when it looked like wealth, and dignity only when it dressed the part. Now a new message pulsed beneath the surface. Power isn't in being seen. Power is in never needing to prove who you are. Jordan leaned back, his eyes closing for the first time in 48 hours. He wasn't tired, just still. And stillness was the only reward he ever wanted, the stillness that comes when a wrong has been righted without rage. As the aircraft lifted off the runway, ascending into the deep violet sky, a ripple passed through every space he left behind: meeting rooms, policy memos, whispers in staff lounges. A ripple that would expand far beyond Halvin International. Because this wasn't just a story about a black man being mistaken. It was a story about what happens when assumptions collide with accountability. When systems of appearance are challenged by the quiet clarity of someone who doesn't need to shout. Jordan didn't fire a warning shot. He just fired the head of the problem. And he did it quietly so that the silence itself would echo. If this story moved you, subscribe to Real Life Stories now for more tales that challenge bias, uplift truth, and remind us that dignity is not a privilege, it's a right.